Hello and welcome. Today I'll be reading for us from the Gospel of Matthew from chapter 18 and chapter 19. I'll be reading chapter 18 verse 1 through 5 and chapter 19 verse 13 to 15. Chapter 18 says, "At that time the disciples came to Jesus and asked, 'Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?' He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. And he said, 'Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever takes this lowly position of a child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me.'" In the next chapter of Matthew, we read that the people brought children to Jesus for him to place his hand on them and pray for them, but the disciples rebuked them. Jesus said, "Let the children come to me, and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." When he placed his hands on them, he went on from there. And so in this account in Matthew, we read Jesus truly sharing with his disciples what it means to have a childlike faith. He wants the children to come to him, and he doesn't want anyone to hinder the children from coming to Jesus. It's very funny that after Jesus tells them that they need childlike faith to be the greatest in the kingdom, one chapter later, the disciples try to keep the children from Jesus. Clearly, they didn't learn the lesson that Jesus wanted them to hear. Jesus wants us to have a childlike faith, but that doesn't mean it's a childish faith. So what's the difference? What does it mean to have a childlike faith that isn't childish? Our faith must be deep and mature and growing, but it does require a childlike faith, something the disciples clearly didn't understand. So what does that look like? He says that the greatest in God's kingdom will be those that have this childlike faith. We see that the childlike faith trusts completely. The implicit trust of a child shows their innocence and childlike faith. A child trusts their parents completely, whatever they say and do, and they're not jaded or skeptical, but trust comes naturally to them. And our faith in God should be likewise. We should trust God implicitly. We should trust what he says and trust what he does in our lives. That is the start of a childlike faith. Next, we see that a childlike faith is inquisitive. Although a childlike faith trusts, it isn't a blind faith, but is open to asking questions and is inquisitive like a child. If you've ever talked to a child for 5 minutes, you'll know that they are inquisitive. They have many questions to ask you. Why is the sky blue? How does the grass grow? Where do babies come from? So a childlike faith is inquisitive. It asks questions, but it doesn't question God, but asks questions in order to learn and grow, just as a child wants to learn and grow. In contrast, our non-childlike questioning serves to disarm or disprove faith and keeps us away from God. Those that question the faith have these questions so that they won't believe in God. They want a reason to not believe and not have faith. But a childlike faith that is inquisitive asks questions in order to know and grow and believe, so that their faith and their belief might grow in learning and in finding the answers to the questions. So our faith trusts like a child and even asks questions like a child, wanting to know and learn and grow in all things. And it isn't a blind faith or a blind trust. Lastly, a childlike faith is completely dependent. A child is totally dependent on their parents for all of their needs, and that is only right. A child must be dependent on their parent, and a parent should provide for the needs of the child. And yet, so often I feel like our relationship with God is very different. We believe in God, but we want to be self-sufficient, and we want to be independent, and we don't want to rely on God. We want to pretend that we can handle it all, that we can take care of ourselves, but that's not what God requires of us. Our relationship to him is like children to parents, that we should be dependent on him. We need to be dependent on him as his children. Being self-sufficient and independent is not going to serve us in our relationship with God. Our faith should make us dependent on God, knowing that we can't handle it ourselves, that we need to turn to God, that we need to depend on him to meet our needs, to guide us, and to take care of us. Just as a child is totally dependent on their parents, so a childlike faith is totally dependent on God. And it's a dependence that grows out of trust, because we trust that when we do rely on God, he will come through for us. He will take care of our needs, that he is dependable and we can trust him. So we don't need to be self-sufficient or independent because we can trust God with our needs to take care of us. That is what a childlike faith looks like. So I pray that as we grow and learn, as we ask the right questions, as we completely trust God with our lives, that we truly have a childlike faith, trust, and dependence on God, and not a childish faith, but one that is mature but trusting, one that continues to grow but is completely reliable and dependent on our Heavenly Father. Thanks be to God.